It's Monday, June 1st, 2020. David was the king of Israel about 1,000 years before the time of Christ, and he lived and ruled during a time when people who were impaired did not have the rights that they have today. That meant that because he was the king, he was free to allow or ban certain people from being in his presence. And if anyone were to come before the king without the king's permission, well, it was within the authority of the king to have that person executed. In some cases by simply pointing the king's scepter at the violator, which would bring the king's guard running to remove the offender to the dungeons. King David, who was well within his rights at the time, gave the standing order that no one who was infirm or crippled would ever sit at his banquet table or great hall. And that rule was rigidly maintained by the guards who were stationed in the doorway of the hall. And perhaps you can imagine having been invited to dine with the king and taken the time to buy new clothes to wear and walked without a limp to the doorway to be escorted to your seat at the table. You knew without a doubt that you were entitled to be there because, well, you'd been invited by the king and you weren't broken or impaired in any way that would prevent you from dining with him. But as the guests quieted down, you would have been able to hear a noise being made by someone who was coming down the hallway. It would have been an odd sound. Clump, slap, scrape, clump, slap, scrape, clump, slap, scrape. And it would have become clear that someone using crutches, someone broken, was making his or her way to the king's table. Soon the broken person would have appeared there in the doorway as he reached the guards, and at the moment you might have expected him to be turned away, you would have seen the guards make way and then help this broken man find his seat at the king's table. And if you would then ask the guests that were sitting near you, they would have told you that the broken man was Mephibosheth, the grandson of King Saul. And that would have made his acceptance there at the table even more curious, because the former King Saul had made himself the sworn enemy of David and had often tried to kill him before David had replaced him as king. Mephibosheth was indeed Saul's grandson, but he was also the son of Jonathan, and Jonathan was a man who had won David's undying friendship and loyalty. Jonathan was a man who was supposed to be king, but had accepted David's right to the throne because God had made it clear that David would reign in Saul's place instead of his own son, Jonathan. And despite the fact that David would replace him, Jonathan, on several occasions, saved David's life. And then by the time David became king, both Saul and Jonathan were dead. So David made a search throughout his kingdom, looking for anyone from Jonathan's family who might still be alive, because, as David put it, I want to show kindness to someone from Jonathan's family, and I want to do that for Jonathan's sake. So the search was made throughout the kingdom, and that's when David's people found the broken Mephibosheth, who was in hiding because he assumed that David would want to kill the grandson of his former enemy, Saul. But Mephibosheth had not reckoned that David would not see him as Saul's grandson, but would instead choose to see him as the son of his old friend Jonathan. And that means that Mephibosheth's place at David's table had been guaranteed by David's loyalty and respect for his father, Jonathan. When David looked at Mephibosheth, he didn't see a broken cripple. He saw his old friend Jonathan, who had laid aside his right to be king and had been willing to die so that David could take the throne. Now, I trust that all of that was clear when we last talked, but at the end of the last time, I asked all of us to ponder the story and wonder where we as individuals fit into the story. I mean, the way I just represented you in the story, you were already seated there at the table in your finest clothes and unbroken. The way I just represented it, you were amazed that a cripple like Mephibosheth would be allowed into the presence of the king. The way I just represented it, you were in the presence of the king because of your own qualifications to be there. But I'm afraid that I did you a disservice when I represented you that way. And I would also be doing myself a disservice if I were to represent myself that way. But think about this. Mephibosheth was not there at the table because he deserved to be there. Mephibosheth was there at the king's table because of Jonathan. Jonathan had set aside his right to be king and to be at the king's table, and Mephibosheth had picked up what Jonathan had so willingly set aside. And that's why we say that when King David looked at Mephibosheth, He didn't see a broken cripple. He saw his old friend Jonathan, who had earned the right for Mephibosheth to be there. And that's where it's important that we all realize that in that story, we are not seated at the king's table, unbroken in our finery. We are the broken cripple standing at the door, waiting for the heavenly king to welcome us to the table. But the king's welcome will not be based on the finery that we're wearing as we come into his presence. The king's welcome will be based entirely on what we have picked up from what Jesus set aside. I say that because of our theme verse for this series. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 9 says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich." A story is told about a man who lived a good, long life and finally found himself standing before St. Peter at the gate of heaven. I'm not sure why he was standing before St. Peter in the story, but that seems to be how these kinds of stories always go. St. Peter stopped him at the gate and said, "Okay, we work on a point system here, and I need to tell you that it takes 5,000 points to get into heaven. So you tell me what you did when you were on earth, and I'll tell you how many points you get for that. Go." Well, there was the challenge. So the man looked at St. Peter and said, "Well, I lived with my wife for more than 40 years and was never unfaithful to her or the promises I made at our wedding." "That's awesome," St. Peter said. "You get 2 points for that." 2 points, the man said, and then added, "How many do I need?" 5,000, said St. Peter. "So that means you only have 4,998 points to go." So the man said, "Well, I raised 3 children through the teen years without killing them." "Awesome," said St. Peter. "That is so impressive that I'm going to give you 3 points for that. So that means that just leaves 4,995 to go." So the man said, "Well, all 3 of those children went to the other side of the world and are serving God there with their families. So that means that our whole family is serving God full time." "Wow, now that's impressive," St. Peter said. "That's good for another 5 points. So that leaves just 4,990 to go." "Hey," the man said, "you know what? I wasn't expecting to have to do this, so I'm really not prepared. And frankly, I've just given you my best shot, and the 3 best things I've ever done have only amounted to 10 points. So I know that I'll never get to 5,000. "I see where you're coming from," St. Peter said. "And I remember when that same thing happened to me." And then Peter added, "I finally just gave up on trying to get to 5,000. And that's when the man that noticed that the Apostle Paul was standing right there too. And Paul spoke up and said, "I'm right there with you, buddy, and I am feeling your pain." And that's when the man decided to take a completely different tack. You know, the man said, "A long time ago, I gave up on the idea that I could earn my way into heaven by working hard enough or by trying to pay off the debt I owe to God. I realized that I was bankrupt before God. And I also realized that it was impossible for me to recover from my spiritual bankruptcy." The man continued, "I owed a debt that I couldn't pay. But Jesus paid a debt he didn't owe. He paid my debt. So if you're asking why you should let me into heaven, I have to say that I'm not coming here today on my own merits. I come here today in the merits of Jesus." "Why didn't you say so in the first place?" St. Peter said. "Enter the joy of your Lord." Now listen to me. No one will ever have that conversation with St. Peter because we won't stand before St. Peter. We'll stand before God at the great white throne judgment. And believe me, you don't want to have that conversation with him at the great white throne, because if you try to earn your way into heaven, you will stand before him bankrupt. So don't wait until it's too late to have that conversation. And don't wait until you can only stand before him on your own merits. Instead, take some time now to pray. And if you haven't already had a conversation with God like that, use this time now as you take some time to pray. There are no magic words that you can say to impress him. And there are no good deeds or good works that you can do to manipulate him to overlook all the deeds and works that were sinful. Instead, I'd recommend that you have a conversation with him today that goes something like this: "God, I owe a debt that I can't pay. So I want to thank you that Jesus paid a debt that he didn't owe. He paid my debt. And I want to thank you that on that day that I stand before you, I will stand there in the merits of Jesus." Why not have that conversation with him today? Let's talk again tomorrow.